Hey, what's up, everyone? All of our enthusiasts, our Psi enthusiasts out there. We have a great episode for you today of Psi Games Talk with Dr. Diane Powell. And I'm here with our co host, Tyler, as well. We're going to be jumping in. We're going to be talking about some really cool things. Most of you out there, if you're in this space, you have already been acquainted with Dr. Diane Powell, where the work that she's doing with the telepathy tapes. She's also been doing this work for a long period of time. And so, welcome, Dr. Powell. How are you?
Thank you. I'm doing well, thank you.
And so, really quickly, just give us a brief synopsis for those who may not be acquainted. I mean, if you're in the space, probably heard your name, but maybe they didn't for whatever reason. Tell us a little bit about you.
Okay. So to make a long story short, I trained as a neuroscientist undergraduate and was really interested in the brain and consciousness, and then really interested in human behavior. Went on to medical school, became a neuropsychiatrist, and also studied child psychiatry, and became interested in autism, particularly autistic savant syndrome, after meeting Oliver Sacks back in 1986. And what intrigued me about savant syndrome is that there are these individuals who can do these extraordinary things, like, for example, solve complex mathematical equations, and yet they were never even taught simple arithmetic. And those kinds of skills are found predominantly in people who are either autistic or who are blind from birth, or occasionally somebody who's struck by lightning or who has a severe head injury. And so when I first heard about that, I thought, there is no model within neuroscience as it currently stands. Of course, it was a relatively new field back then, but there's no model within science that could understand savant syndrome, and yet it was accepted as something that was real. And I went on to be on faculty at Harvard, and while I was there, I met a patient who I just had met her 5 minutes before, and she started just doing a reading on me. She wasn't a professional psychic, but she was someone who said that since birth, she would get information about people. And she told me things about myself in remarkable detail, like, for example, that my husband was a chemist and that we were moving to San Diego. And so it was not only that she knew things specifically about me at that time, but then there were several things she said were going to happen in the future. And when they happened, one by one, I was like, okay, this is something that I really want to study. And I had a background in physics, and I have a brother who is a theoretical physicist with expertise in robotics, AI, and quantum physics. He had worked with Max Weber, who was the person who discovered gravity waves, and that was actually what he was working on when he was working on his master's. And so I'm somebody who's both a theoretician and a trained neuropsychiatrist, and so I've combined the two. And I wrote a book that was published in 2008 titled The ESP Enigma, A Scientific Case for Psychic Phenomena. And in that book, I really talk about how the model for understanding the brain and consciousness is incomplete and probably wrong. And I talk about some of the evidence that really points to these phenomena being real, and also go into some physics, describing some of these concepts for lay people without a science background that would help them understand that there's really, not only is it that the model in neuroscience is incomplete and doesn't explain anything that we know is real. I mean, it doesn't even explain how, what consciousness is, let alone how it could possibly be created by the brain. But of course, that's sort of this assumption within neuroscience that you can't challenge, the idea that the brain creates consciousness. And so I talk about that, and then I also talk about how physics, when you really look at it at the micro level, at the quantum level, it's far more it's far more bizarre than you could ever imagine. And it's really, reality is not really what we think it is. And our concept of time is an illusion, that there really isn't an arrow that just moves forward. And so I wrote the book, and if people want copies of it, it's out of print, but I have remaining copies, and they can go to my website to get them. And so I wrote the book, and it was actually favorably reviewed by my medical school, Johns Hopkins, and it was even adopted by several university libraries. But it got me into trouble because uh, neuroscientists and particularly psychiatrists are not supposed to say that these phenomena are possible. And so I basically decided, okay, um, let me see if I can find experimental research. And what I did was I doubled down and started looking for savants, because I thought that they would really be the Rosetta Stone for understanding consciousness. And I was invited to India and did meet some savants. And while I was there, I was just as I was leaving, I was told that they were all telepathic in addition to the savant skills they had. And I thought, oh well, if it's true that they're telepathic, then I need to study that first, because how do I know they're not getting the answers from, if I'm asking them to solve a mathematical equation, and how do I know that they're not getting the answers from me? And so I came back and I started talking on podcasts about how I was interested in that. And very soon after that, I was contacted by the father of a girl named Haley, whose father was a psychiatrist like me, and he had been blown away because he had two different therapists working with his daughter who came to him independently and said, "Your daughter's reading my mind. And I don't understand it." And his daughter was also evaluated by Daryl Treffert, who is famous for his expertise on the savant syndrome, and he was the expert who was consulted for the making of Rain Man, which for a lot of people that was their first entry into even knowing that something like savant syndrome existed. So that was 13 years ago that I did extensive testing with her, and I've tested many children since then. And Kai Dickens contacted me about 4 years ago and said she wanted to follow me and meet some of the people that who had contacted me and that I hadn't met yet, to do some experiments. And so that's what she did. And she was so blown away that she was like, wow, okay, we need to make this into a docuseries or whatever. But she wanted to do a podcast first so that we could maintain control over it, rather than that what the networks wanted to do, which is that they wanted to put their own spin on it.
Wow, that was very well put in such a short. You just went right through it. And here we are. Then this weirdo named Hakeem got in contact with you and told you about some games where you're like, yeah, let's do it. So I find one of the things that I find very interesting about your story, but there's an overlap with a lot of other people's story who gets involved in this type of field and starts recognizing that there's more to consciousness and more to the human being than science is explaining, and starts looking into that what is this? And this happens throughout our history, that as you start having people have these awakenings or have these moments where they see things a little bit differently, the same thing that we rely on so much and call scientific method or science is the same thing that turns around and bashes those people for thinking out of the box and trying to solve a new problem. And I find that really fascinating, but also scary at the same time. And what did that feel like for you when you're like, hey, I'm a sound scientist, I'm doing sound research, and these people they're either not looking at the research that I'm putting out and the data that I'm putting out, or they don't, they're looking at it, but they don't want to accept it or even like really do a full review of it, and they're willing to throw me to the curb or try to hurt my career just because of that. How does that feel, and why do you think that is?
Oh, well, I got PTSD from it.
Wow.
Because it was one of those things where just based on the title, it was determined that I was engaged in magical thinking and therefore probably psychotic. And so they removed my license on an emergency basis.
Wow.
And I was a single mother, and with a daughter, in high school, and needed my income. And I had to hire attorneys and undergo testing to prove that I wasn't psychotic. I didn't have any history of that at all. And it showed me how entrenched this idea is, that if somebody says, if I can't even write a book about it, because nowhere in that book do I say anything about, oh, I'm psychic, and nowhere in there do I say these things have definitively been proven. I just said there's no reason to say they're impossible. And there are all of these people who have been doing this research for 100 years or more, and lists a lot of those studies, many of which were paid for by military intelligence. So, that's what I'm laying out. And if I can have my license taken away, think about, what that says about the extremity of the reaction here. Because I've heard patients say to me things that they've experienced that they're afraid to tell anybody else, because they're afraid that they would get put on a medication and that there'd be this stigma forever in their medical record.
Mm. Yeah.
Especially in this day of electronic records. Yeah, like for example, I had a patient of mine who said to her primary care doctor that she has this relationship with horses. She's been riding horses since she was a kid. That she has this relationship with horses, that she can read the horse, that she knows what the horse is thinking. Okay, well, that primary care doctor wrote me a letter saying, I saw this patient today, and I think you ought to consider putting her on an antipsychotic.
Mm.
So, why is it that I think that the opinions are so entrenched? Well, I think that it's the problem is that when we go through all of our training, we are told certain things in such a way that it's like, and you don't question this. It's done in an extremely dogmatic way, and if you look at if you look at the way that people respond to social pressure, to not wanting to stand out as different, that's a huge social force that keeps people from raising their hand and saying, "Well, I disagree. I have a different experience." And so there's a kind of a conspiracy of silence, so to speak, because you have a lot of people who privately will say, well, I don't consider myself psychic, but I've had this little experience or that little experience, or they'll say, or I've witnessed this or that. It's made me have a fundamental shift in how I see things. They might have had an out of body experience, or they may have had a patient who had a near death experience. There could be, or they may have had just a feeling that something was wrong with somebody, and then they find out that person died that very day. And so those kinds of things happen. They've been happening, as long as humans been on the planet, and across all cultures. And it's only more recently, if you think about it, the scientific method that says that to think other than how you're taught is to be irrational.
Mm.
And nobody wants to get labeled irrational. And once a certain area of study has become taboo, because for you to even think it's worth studying makes you look like you're irrational. If you ask a lot of these people, like Rupert Sheldrake, who've wanted to get into debates with some of these diehard skeptics. And some individuals like Hubert, who is very, very articulate, have gotten into these debates with skeptics. And the skeptics will say, I don't even look at the data. I don't want to. I don't need to. I already know that you're wrong.
Yeah.
That's the level that this attitude is entrenched. So it's really not the conversation that really, when I went into academia, one of the reason why I went into academia is that I love to have intelligent discourse with other people who are deep thinkers. And when I discovered that academia is no longer that it's really about staying within the confines of a very narrow paradigm, and yet all the great advances in science are ones in which you step out of that. I mean, could Einstein have even done what he did back then today? I don't think he could have.
Mm.
Could you be a patent clerk and come up with this theory that's a thought experiment that's so bizarre when you're saying that time is relative? Could you really do that today? I don't know if you could, and you have the receptivity that it did back then.
Yeah, I think it's going off what you said, though, I want to make sure that people know that there was a happy kind of ending to your story. You did get your license back. I'm correct, right? So they did. So at some point they looked at your research and
no, they never looked at my research. They never
looked at it. Okay.
I got that was a mistake on Kai's part. No, they never looked at my research. They But what happened was I underwent 3 days of intensive psychological testing. I mean, everything you can imagine, from personality testing to ink blots to IQ testing to, everything. And I got a clean bill of health.
Mm.
And so it was, they had to give it back to me. I mean, the recommendation was, well, okay, it's like, maybe she needs to be hospitalized. Literally, I mean, maybe she needs to be hospitalized.
Wow.
I mean, to see this psychiatrist report to the board, I mean, it was just unbelievable. They were that convinced I might be psychotic just because I wrote a book on this. And so, no, it was that it turned out I wasn't. So I got back my license and I practiced for another 12 years. But I knew that if they had trouble with a book titled The ESP Enigma, that they would really have trouble with a podcast called the Telepathy Tapes. And I, especially since, I'm doing research. And so, so I retired, I'm retirement age, so I retired from practicing medicine and decided to devote my time to full-time research.
Mm, mm. Well, that's beautiful that you were able to, get it back. And now here you are doing this. And I guess one of my other questions is, why do you think, like, this is, if one of my conspiracy theories, or it's not really a conspiracy theory, it's just like an idea. And this idea is like, it just seems like we have this ability, and the ancient people were talking about these abilities and writing about them and so on and so forth. And then for some reason, and there's still a huge portion of the population who believe that these type of abilities exist, but only for people that they read about in their manuals or documents or, things of that nature. But then those same people will turn around and say, like, people like you or me are crazy because we think that modern day people still have those gifts. And so then it begs to question this idea that, is there some sort of underlying, concept or some underlying plan to keep us from stepping into our studying and researching and stepping into our full potential as multidimensional beings, as these beings that have these abilities, that are walking around, that could improve these abilities and things of that nature? Because it seems like there's so much so much in academia that's fighting against that without even, like you said, looking at the data, wanting to accept it. Instead of having these clear-cut debates, which is how we got this far with any of the explorations that we had or discoveries that we had. We've gotten there through inquiry and research and then figuring out. But history is filled with people who came up with ideas that ended up being true. Like, we thought the sun revolved around us, and anything to say anything other was going to get you killed. And then we thought, a person thought, hey, there must be these germs in the air or something in the air that's infecting people and killing them, that we can't see. And people thought that was crazy. And then people said there are these waves floating through the air that you could kind of pick up other transmissions off of. And people thought that was crazy. And each time it turns out to be real, once you start diving in and doing real research. What do you think that is? What do you think is happening there? Does it feel, it just to me feels sometimes like there's these powers that be that are trying to get us to not go down that path, because then if people start to awaken, it could be like that you wouldn't have any control of it, so it'd be a lot harder to control people if they could read your mind and things of that nature.
Yeah. So I really think that some of the things that I'm, researching are really, abilities that our ancestors, if you go back far enough in time, our ancestors had these abilities in spades. And I think that a lot of the ancient wisdom traditions are ones in which they reveal that people had a very, very sophisticated understanding, and that what's happened is we've lost that. And whether or not it's that we lost that, we lost a lot of this knowledge because there was like this tremendous flood that occurred, 10,000 years ago or whenever that was, that there was just this tremendous disaster that caused the oceans to rise, and a lot of civilization got buried under the ocean. And, and a lot of that knowledge got buried along with it. And that we're really trying to recover that information. So that's one hypothesis. But another way of thinking about this is that I think that we as humans, our birthright is such that we actually have we have tremendous powers, but we are actually ignorant to them. I mean, there are a lot of people like you studying, this blind sight, studying, putting this mask on and being able to read using your, third eye, to put it in colloquial terms. It's like, a lot of people are sort of discovering, well, gee, if I really put the time into it, maybe I can do some of these things. So it's a kind of a reawakening of something, because you're reawakening the belief that it's possible. And so I think what happened is that somewhere along the line, we went from being a culture in which we were living in our fullness, to being one in which you basically, I'll use the word patriarchal. Okay, but patriarchy doesn't just mean, that it's only men that participate in it, but a culture in which you went from you don't own the land, like what the indigenous people say, the Native Americans that I've worked with. They're like, wait, you don't own land. Okay, but you went into this idea of, I want to own this land and I want to pass it down to my children and my children's children and whatever. And so people started building their own little empires, and then those empires became even bigger empires. It wasn't enough to just own your land and whatnot. It was like, oh, I could own, more land, and I could have people work that land rather than it being me work the land. And so it just grew. And I think a lot of that was growing out of people out of impulses of greed or power or whatever. And people went along with it to a certain extent, for whatever reasons, people have gone along with it. And what's happened is over time, we've seen the discrepancies between the people who, these people who are extremely wealthy. And then we have, a major problem of homelessness in this country, for example. And so the wealth gap is huge. And so then I think that there are sort of various mechanisms in play to try to manage people under those circumstances, because you don't want a rebellion on your hands.
Yeah. And a loss of power, a loss of that.
Yeah. And so what's happened is that one of the ways in which you can keep people controlled is to keep them confused. And in order to make somebody confused, you've got to mess with their intuition, which gives you more of that discernment of whether or not something rings true. And you're playing in your head, with an analytical process of, oh, well, what do I, that person went to Harvard and that person went to, lesser university, and therefore I'm going to believe the person at Harvard, or, oh, that person is the head of, this department at that university. Of course, what they say is going to be, more accurate than this other person. So so this hierarchy developed within science that became more about the hierarchy than it did the knowledge that science is supposed to be about. I mean, conscience, shin, that's all knowledge, consciousness, like Khan is with, it's like with knowledge, it's like with awareness, and so science is actually the root of, has the same root as consciousness. And what's happened is we had this split where science became more about, only that which can be objectified and treated as separate from us and approached quantitatively and analytically. And if you start applying intuition to it, if you start applying some other process to obtain that information, like, your ancient shamans used to take, various, plant substances that would put them in an altered state, and then they'd have a download of information. And nobody was saying, yeah, but what journal did you publish that in? And so you had this split between, during the age of reason, all for the, it was supposed to be cleaning up the irrationality. It's like supposed to be cleaning everything up. Oh, well, we'll just create this thing called science. And so, and I think part of that is because before the age of reason, we already had the age of big religion. Okay. I mean, if how old is the Catholic Church, for example? You have your original Christianity, and and then indigenous religions in different places, and then you started getting organization of those, so that now you have a intermediary between you and God, or between you and spiritual knowledge. And so it became subject to, oh, and by the way, pay this tithe to the church. And if you've sinned, maybe you could buy your way into heaven, just, confess to the priest and be sure to leave a donation at the at the basket on your way out. And so that's what organized religion unfortunately did. And so I think initially science was just trying to carve out its own thing that religion wouldn't say, well, you can't do that. So I think that the reason behind the scientific revolution, or in the age of reason, was the intentions were good to begin with. But then what happened is that you started having this approach to knowledge where it had to stay within this really siloed, have your blinders on approach to accessing that knowledge, and it can only be through experiments and and logical analysis. So that's in a nutshell my take on the history of science.
That was a lot. That was really good. Thank you for that. Tyler, you have anything you want to ask?
Yeah, just touching on that. Do you see, because I think there's something powerful in the data with parapsychology and ESP research, but I think looking at how the telepathy tapes have been received, it seems like there's a shift happening to be more experiencer focused. So people are more interested when it's personal, when they know the people. But I feel like the more powerful thing is when you look into the data of telepathy. So maybe do you see a shift happening in what people are looking at, or kind of getting people interested in telepathy and ESP?
Well, I think what first of all, I mean, most your average person is not going and looking up parapsychology journals. Yeah, they don't even know that parapsychology journals exist,
Mm-hmm.
and so and you're not seeing the mainstream media report what's in the parapsychology journals. So I'm on the board of the Parapsychological Association for the third time, and the Parapsychological Association is actually a division within the Academy of Science. Okay, Margaret Mead helped to get it that status. That it really is a true scientifically rigorous approach to these phenomena that fall within our within our purview, and things like precognition or telepathy or clairvoyance, and so you have what you have is you have a lot of parapsychologists who know that there's just this amazing research that's been done. There are these amazing anecdotes. But what happens is that it just has stayed within a relatively small group of people who are aware of that, and so then the lay public, who's mainly listening in the past to media, they're just not aware of it. And then what's happened is now we have podcasts, and we have people. The podcasts are becoming more popular than any of the news networks out there. I mean, more people listen to Joe Rogan, for example, than listen to the nightly news on any of the regular stations.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, people are actually becoming aware there's a lot of stuff out there that's really fascinating. And so I really think that this uptick in interest in parapsychology is directly related to the freedom to accessing information that the internet has given us. So people, so I, kudos to the people that have been doing this for a long time, putting these podcasts out there, because I mean, it's finally taking off. The other thing, and one of the reasons why I think that the telepathy tapes was so successful, is that instead of it being me just, doing, writing up a paper that then gets published into a parapsychology journal about all these anecdotes I've been told over the years, letting people actually hear it from the people themselves. So that there's something about hearing the voice of this person just going, well, she sounds like such a nice lady. She reminds me of my Aunt Martha, or or they're getting an opportunity to, it's like putting real voices in the documentary, the film will put real faces behind some of these stories, and then it puts it in a format that we as humans can digest easily. You're not asking me to read this paper that doesn't make sense to me, that then you all have all the skeptics shooting it down. It's like it goes over people's heads. It doesn't draw them in if all you're doing is describing it that way. But when you put a human factor into it, then it puts it in this realm where people are like, oh yeah, I remember meeting this person once who told me a story similar to that.
Right.
Or this sounds a little bit like how I know my friend's going to call me. I always just pick up the phone right before, So what happens is that in a way it kind of normalizes it, and then you're hearing similar stories. It's the sheer volume of it too. I mean, it's like I have had. Over the years, I've had around 60 families from all around the world contact me, and their stories are almost identical. I have this child who lost their ability to speak when they were, between, 1 and 2.5 years old. I was told that this child is mentally deficient. Give up on them. They'll never amount to anything. They're going to be like a perennial, toddler in terms of their capacity. And there are parents who don't want to give up on their kid. They love their kid, and the vast majority of these parents are highly educated, and so a lot of them they're doctors, they're engineers, they're IT specialists, they're lawyers, psychologists. I mean, and so what happens is that their child gets services, and they discover that, oh, there's this way in which a child could learn how to type to communicate. That point to letters on a board and communicate, because they have motor issues. They have really poor coordination, and the reason why they can't speak is because they don't have a good sense of where their tongue is in their mouth. Similarly, they don't have a good sense of where their body extends out. A lot of them will tell you that they don't know their hands are there until they see them. Okay, and so they're missing this major sensory system, the proprioceptive system, that tells you where your body is spaced. And so, but they can learn oftentimes to point to letters. And then the first thing the person who's taking care of them notices is that, oh, this kid has more language than I realized. I mean, this kid, it's not that we're starting off with very elementary, C-spot run type English. And so then the next thing they learn is that the child will make a mistake that'll be the person who's working with them's mistake. And they'll go, oh, so they'll go, well, wait a minute, that's the kind of way that I flip letters, and you flipped them like I do, or they'll think that the child's a mathematical savant, because it's like, oh, this kid can answer every mathematical question, accurately. But then something happens where they derive the wrong answer, and because their calculator breaks or whatever, they derive the wrong answer, and the kid gives the wrong answer. And then they ask the kid, oh, what's going on here? And the kid says, well, I'm reading your mind. And they go, oh, and then they test it, and they're like, oh my gosh, how could this be? And then they go on the internet, and then they do a search, and then they see that there's an expert on autism who's already studying these cases, and as I said, I've had that's basically the story, and I've heard it from people all over the world, all kinds of different cultures. And I've been able to actually do controlled studies on many of these. I mean, it's certainly not nowhere near 60. I mean, so I've only been able to study about 10% of the kids that who contacted me. I was doing it on my own, at my own expense, paying for it out of my own practice.
Yeah. Wow, that's powerful. So what would you say is, you talked about these autistic savants, and you talked about how people would not have a skill and then all of a sudden have a skill because something may happen. What's your take on that? Is that, there's talk about us, the consciousness being full of knowledge, it being this kind of energy or stream or the matrix or something like that out there, that our brain kind of can, tap into that and filter out this information or pull out this information. And then you have a person who did not know something, all of a sudden get into an accident or have an illness, and then, or a near death experience, come out of it. And now all of a sudden they can do math that they never knew how to do. They can speak languages they never learned before. And what's that? What's happening?
Well, I put on my theoretician hat, and what made the most sense to me was I was looking for, like, what's the common denominator here? What is it that all of these experiences have in common that seem to lead to these abilities? And what I discovered was that it's having an out-of-body experience. And so for example, another group that can have a lot of psychic abilities are people that were traumatized severely as a small child, because the small children can disassociate very easily. And what I mean by disassociate is they experience their consciousness outside their body. And so what I think happens is that after you've had that that out-of-body experience where, you've seen yourself from up above, or maybe you've also seen angels, or who knows what else you saw, but you had an experience that put you out of the sort of siloed, or blinder, tunnel vision that you have when you're embodied, where something takes you out of your body, some kind of shock experience, or maybe even cardiac arrest, and then you come back into the body, and you're able to remember that experience, and you're forever changed. And then you realize that consciousness is not something confined to the body, that the body is a tool of consciousness rather than what creates consciousness. And that's how I see the brain, is that I see the brain as something that enables us to navigate consciousness rather than being what generates consciousness. Once you flip it, you say that the brain's not creating consciousness, but actually what navigates consciousness, then suddenly everything can make sense. Then suddenly it's like you realize that we're just living in a huge informational matrix that is highly organized. And once you learn how to decode it, you can access whatever information you want.
Yeah. There is that sense of, in our normal society, the way we learn now is that we feel like we go in to a school or a library, or nowadays on the internet, and you have to take a class and you learn how to do something, and then that's something you have to practice, and then you get it, which that may be one way to do it. But some people have thought for a while that was the only way to do it. So therefore, a person will have this experience, and then they'll come back and they have this information, and it blows people's mind, because they're just like, there's no way, because they had to have known it. They had to have studied it when they were a kid and forgot, that's the only way. But I love the way that you're saying, if we shift that narrative to say, hey, no, there's this information out there, and the brain kind of is the tool to navigate that, then it does make sense. It means that there's something out there, some information out there. Now, I think another question that I have for you is, like, we're talking about the Psi Games, and, this was my brainchild as a way, or a download really, as a way to kind of see well, how do we get youth and adults and people who've been doing the research all in the same place and kind of share this knowledge with the hopes of ushering in a new age where we have the next generation who already believes in this and who can pass that on to the next generation, and how the world would change with that. I think sometimes some of the pushback that I've gotten from some people was that, oh, well, you need it was something that you mentioned earlier, because people who had trauma in their past tend to do well with this sometimes, that people feel like, oh, well, everybody has to have trauma. But I believe that you can get there through love and light and clearing out, excuse my language, but clearing out all the shit, that has been piled on you over the time, over this time. And actually that might be a way, and to do it create a collaborative environment where people can come together and celebrate this, versus an environment where people want to ridicule or prove you wrong or something like that. But people are already like, yeah, we believe it. Let's come together and see how far we can go. That would really shift things. In your experience, how does that sit with you? How does that feel for you?
Oh yeah, no, I'm in 100% agreement in the sense that I believe that. So a simple way to put it is that different emotions that we feel, when you're talking about feeling, a lot of what you're talking about is your heart. Okay, you're talking about your energy pattern when you're feeling that. Okay, we can do thermography and we can show that different parts of the body are cool and hot depending upon what emotion it is you're feeling, and you're putting off a certain frequency when you're feeling love, which is very different from the kind of frequencies you're putting off when you're feeling hate, and that's different from indifference. And so one of the things that happens when you're feeling love is that you're feeling a harmonizing energy. And it's a harmonizing energy that is attractive. Think about how attractive someone is who's in love, or to being around people that are in love. It actually, there's a magnetism, so to speak, about that. It's like, and so what happens is that when we're in a loving space, we draw things to us that are kind of what we want to draw to us. It's something that I've noticed in at being a therapist, when I've seen people go from being depressed to being in a very positive, loving space, go very differently in their life. And all of a sudden they start attracting a lot of really positive things into their life. Mm-hmm. And so I think that our being, developing opening up the heart, developing that connection between the mind and the heart, and being in that space of love, it's expansive and it's attractive, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. I actually, my teacher's teacher, my teacher told me a story about his teacher, the grandmaster. And he said in Japan, my teacher used to always tell us, think with your mind, think with your mind. And then we were like, oh, okay. So they were in here processing. But as they got older in the system and they started to learn, actually what the grandmaster meant was, he was saying the mind wasn't in the head, it was in your heart. And so he was like, feel it with your mind, feel it with or think with your mind, but it wasn't here, it was in your heart. That was where the true knowledge was kept. And it took them a while to realize that. And then they did, especially coming from an American culture, and they weren't understanding what this this guy was saying. And he was like, no, this is not what we think it is. This is this brain up here. It really is down here. It really is coming from our heart centeredness, our heart coherence, and us being able to use our feeling these things out. And that's really that's the type of community we're trying to create with the Psi Games, is a community that is working through the heart and seeing how we can connect and collect together and come together so that we can really explore these gifts that we have in a way that allows us to kind of move beyond the lie that we've been told for so many years, which is, and that has been suppressed. And if you don't know, I think we haven't talked about it, but my job in the military I was a sergeant in psychological operations, so PSYOP, psychological warfare. So seeing these patterns out in the world and about how people get attacked, and when they speak, like yourself, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like this is like PSYOP 101. We're trying to somebody's trying to suppress something here, and how powerful would it be if you had a lot, how much power would that hierarchy lose if more people could know everything and connect with one another, and we couldn't be separated, because I could really feel what's going on in your soul. I could really know that you don't really hate me and I don't really hate you. We actually could get down to it, and it's not about the meme I saw online, and it's not about the little clip that I saw on TikTok. It's something more. We are something more. And that would make it very difficult for people at the top to keep us separate,
One of my favorite and my daughter's favorite Christmas stories is The Grinch Who Stole Christmas. And one of the reasons why that's one of our favorites is here you have this Grinch who he can't stand the little who's in Whoville. They're all so happy and he's just such a grump, And so rather than, like join them and go, oh, they might know something I don't know. He's like, no, I want to destroy their happiness. And so he decides he's going to pretend he's Santa and steal all their gifts. And so he steals all their gifts. And what happens? I don't want to give the plot away, but
I think everybody's seen it.
Everybody knows, it doesn't destroy their Christmas, because Christmas was never really about the material gifts. Christmas was about the love and the joy of celebration of being together. And so that's really, that's the world that we all want to live in. And it's to me it's toxic to have this messaging constantly, like you'll be happy once you have this, and it's never enough. It's never enough. I mean, and that paradigm. I think more and more people are realizing that paradigm doesn't work. It just doesn't work, and they're looking for answers now. And so many of those answers are going to be found through going within, but also going within and having established a community.
Yeah.
And you're talking about a community that's really going to do both.
Yeah. That's the trick. Tyler, I'm going to give you a chance because I've been dominating over here.
Well, I got that. Hakeem, I got to get my UFO question in. So,
okay. I want to cap off what she just said, because Diane, this is exactly so I have an ulterior motive that I tell people, and they always say, oh, that must be something bad coming. And I'm like, no, actually, I'm watching my youth at the schools that I own. I own 2 martial arts schools, and I've seen kids have the struggle with video games and external fulfillment. And I have, and part of the reason of coming up with the Psi Games was not just for adults, but for youth to be able to have fun playing these, learning these abilities and diving into them, and then giving them inspiration to get better. And then telling them, all people involved in the Psi Games, that the way you get better, the way based on what we know, is to spend more time inside. And if you can motivate people to spend more time inside, I kind of feel like all the work will be done from that point. Just to get them to spend more time inside. And then consciousness, the universe, whatever you want to call it, is going to take over, and it's going to cleanse us of all of the shit that I was just talking about. Excuse my language, right? But it's going to start cleansing. And by you getting better at telepathy, or you getting better at mind sight, and the way you're getting better is to do more meditation and do more reflection, to do more introspection, that you are going to find that you are not separate, that you are a part of the whole, and that you'll find that true love, that true light within yourself. And that's going to really give you the answer. And that's going to raise all ships, you know, and hopefully the more people who come through the Psi Games will start experiencing that, and we'll build a strong paradigm shift that's one around internal awareness, and then bringing that internal externally to more people who may not have had that internal awareness. Anyway, I just had to say that because, you know, this Whoville, you know, analogy was perfect. You know, this idea that it's all about this stuff, these gifts. And no, it's not about the gifts. It's about the gift. It's not about the external gifts. It's about the gifts we share inside as a community, and us realizing that that love is truly what it's all about. And that's the same thing here. We have these abilities that we're going to have fun with, and so on and so forth. But it's really not about that. It's really about our connection.
Yep.
Sorry, I just.
No, some of that doesn't even happen in the moment, right? Like some of that is realized. You could realize that after the fact, because a lot of psychic experiences are spontaneous. So a lot of the time, just like what you were saying about realizing and then having these discussions of how powerful it is to relate to something like the telepathy tapes, to have a real world discussion after and be like, man, I had a precognitive dream, you know, like, and then, you know, those relationships happen. I think the Psi Games facilitates that even more too, where newer people who aren't that familiar can, you know, kind of test themselves and see what this is all about and explore it. I think that's powerful and important now for what we need in the field. So it's refreshing. But I got to get my UFO question in because you've recently been mentioned too with the Skywatcher team, which I find it interesting with this whole psionics thing. But I wonder, a lot of interaction with the craft, UFO craft that is talked about, uses what experiencers call is telepathy. So I wonder what your research, have you done any research into experiencers in terms of interacting with the craft or flying the craft using telepathy, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I haven't done any experiments on that. I mean, I've certainly interviewed people who've had those experiences, and I don't really know how much I'm at liberty to talk about it, to be honest. But what I'll say is that I think that what we're talking about here is really the fact that telepathy is not something that is just unique to humans. It's not something that's unique to between members of the same species, and so it makes sense that telepathy would be kind of more of a universal way of connecting with any kind of species besides our own. And then the question is, like, how do you even define what is conscious? I mean, we tend to once you walk away from the paradigm that says brain equals consciousness, then it opens up the possibility that you can have consciousness where you don't have a brain. And there are some people that say, one of the easiest examples for people to relate to, although not everybody's going to relate to this because they're not aware of the literature in it, but it's the literature that's about plants and how plants actually respond in ways that demonstrate a consciousness of sorts. There was this research that was done by Cleve Baxter in which he would put the same equipment he used to do lie detection tests on people, so it's measurements of physiological data. He one day he just, he decided to, put it onto a plant, and he saw that what he was thinking affected the plant. That the plant would actually show stress if he's thinking, "Oh, I'm going to just clip off this leaf here," or I'm going to, set this plant over here on fire with this match. And so this idea that consciousness is something that is confined to to just animals, it appears to be incorrect. And then it goes on from there. And certainly everything has energy. Everything has energy. I mean, some of these savants are able to feel the energy of different rocks, and we know that rocks have different crystalline properties. They have different magnetic properties. Some of them, like a magnetite, which has acts like a magnet, but and then you have the other types of magnetic properties, and so they're and the way they interact with light is different. And so anyway, so the point is that there's energy in everything, and we're just talking about differences in density. You could think of it as that which we think of as being. We know that what we think of as solid is not really solid. We know that that atoms are not solid; they're predominantly space. And so you can think of those things that we think of that have like a solid appearance to us as being something that's just vibrating at a lower frequency. But that doesn't mean, and we know that doesn't mean that that's all there is. But that's how science acts. It acts as though the only thing that is that exists is that which I can measure, and we can only measure a narrow range of frequencies. We only see a small percentage of the frequency of electromagnetism. We only hear a small fraction of vibration and sound. And we know of other species who have a broader range than we do. And we know that there's all of what we call dark energy and dark matter in the universe. I mean that there's more dark energy and dark matter in the universe than there is visible energy and matter. Well, all that dark energy and dark matter, all that means is that we can't measure it. And we can't measure it because we're limited in our measuring tools. And so for science to then act as though, let's just ignore that, even though we said that, the majority of stuff we can't measure, the only thing that exists is that which we can measure. I mean, but we know it exists. We just can't measure it. So it's like I see how science has kind of put itself in these paradoxes like that. And so so when it comes to these things like UAPs, and these and some of them appear to be conscious, and they don't have a pilot. That there's no one piloting that craft, and someone can interact with it and actually attract it. Then that's telling us that, as I said, and what was attracted was actually a loving energy. And this person felt love afterwards. And as I was saying, there's this attractive quality of love, and there's a harmonizing of it. So I think that there's I hope that helps. I mean,
absolutely. Thank you.
Well, I think we hit so many good topics, and I would just love to close out with what are you going to be talking about at the Psi Games?
Well, I'm really interested. I mean, this whole idea of living in an informational field, and the Akashic records, and our ability to access that, and so I'm going to be talking a little bit about that.
Oh, that's going to be wonderful. That's going to be wonderful. Well, we're going to have more information about Dr. Diane Powell in the show notes. And I just want to thank her for coming out and sharing some time with us. And Tyler, anything you want to say?
No, thank you very much. Been very informative, and looking forward to more episodes and your work in the future. Thank you.
Yes, it's going to be fantastic. Dr. Powell, you've done amazing work. Again, reading your book and then also finding you through the telepathy tapes and then a few conversations that we've had. I really am grateful for your energy, your courage, your ability to keep striving and thriving through all of the challenges and triumphing over them to where we are now, to where you still, it would be very easy for somebody to give up and say, you know what, I'm done. Let me go off and do something that people approve of. But instead, you're still a champion for us in this space. And now it looks like the work that you've done and others have done is really going to take us to the next phase. So we're here now, and I appreciate you, and I thank you for being who you are.
Oh, well, thank you.
Well, thanks.
Step into the beyond, let your mind ignite, where the limits dissolve in the glow of the light. A world unseen, we will rise to explore, unlocking the depths of our universal core.